How do we create a custom user model for our Django REST Framework project? First, let me introduce you the Django user model and explain what it is. So, as you might know, Django comes with a built-in authentication system. This is one of Django's key selling points. It comes with a lot of built-in functionality for authentication right out of the box. This provides us with a basic framework of features that we can use in our project, including registration, login, and authentication. So Django provides tools that make it relatively easy to handle these. While there's still some work we need to do, Django has already taken care of much of it for us. The Django authentication system integrates with the Django admin, which is another great feature of Django. It provides an admin interface with very little coding required. It's important that we define a user model for our project. The default Django user model is the foundation of the authentication system, and it means Django comes with a built-in user model, a predefined structure that represents a user in your application. This model includes fields like username, password, email, and permissions, and is tightly connected to Django's authentication system. Django comes with a default user model. This has some issues that I find. For example, by default, it uses a username instead of a user's email address. And also, it's not very easy to customize once you already start developing on a project using the default user model. What I suggest is that even if you don't need to customize anything in the user model and just want to use the default functionality, you should still define a custom user model in your project, just like we will be doing in this section of the course. This means that if you ever decide to modify the user model in the future, it will be much easier for you. It will save you from having to deal with complicated migration changes and related issues later on. The main difference between our custom user model and the default one is that we will be using an email instead of a username, but I will show you how to set up a custom user model from scratch, so you will be prepared to add more customizations to your project later on. This will also help future-proof the project in case we want to make changes to the user model later on, as I mentioned earlier. So, how do we customize the Django user model? Well, first we need to create a model that we can use, and we will base it on Django's built-in AbstractBaseUser and PermissionsMixin classes. Once we have defined our model, we then move on to create a custom manager. The manager is mostly used for integrating with the Django CLI, but it's also responsible for tasks like creating and managing user objects. I will explain that a bit more in a moment. Once you have defined the model and the manager, you can set the auth user model configuration in your settings file. This tells your Django project to use the custom user model you have created. Finally, you can create and run the migrations for your project using the new custom user model, and Django will set up and configure the database to use your custom model. So, the AbstractBaseUser class is one of the classes that we are going to be using to create our custom model, and it provides all of the features for authentication, but it doesn't include any fields, so we need to define all of the fields for our model ourselves. But that's okay, because there's only a few minimal fields that we need to provide. The PermissionsMixin base class is used for the Django permission system, so Django comes with a permission system that allows you to assign permissions to different users, and it integrates with the Django admin. To support that, we are going to use the PermissionsMixin base class. The PermissionsMixin base class provides all the default fields and methods needed for our user model to work with Django's authentication system. Next, I'm going to explain some of the common issues that people have when they are customizing the Django user model. The first and probably most common issue is running your migrations before setting up your custom user model. I recommend creating your custom model before running your migrations. Since we have already created migrations for this project, we will need to clear them, and I will show you how to do that later in this section. So it's always recommended that you set your custom user model first before you create any migrations for your project. Another common issue is typos in your configuration. This is a pretty frequent problem in general, but especially when setting important settings like auth user model. If the value is incorrect, it can cause issues that are hard to debug, since Django doesn't always throw a clear error for a typo in the configuration. As we saw in the previous video, even a small typo in the settings.py file, like the one we had with the database configuration, can break the project without a very obvious error message. Lastly, we have indentation issues, which can be a bit tricky. These often occur in the manager or the model, and I will point out where you might run into them as we go through this section and write code for our project. We are going to take a look at the design of the custom user model that we are going to implement. So the fields that we are going to implement is the email field, which is going to be used for storing the email address of the user. The name field will be used to store the user's name. Is active, which is a Boolean field used to determine whether a user is active or not. And this is useful if you need to disable users in the system but keep their accounts. For example, you might want to retain their account details but prevent them from logging in for some reason. Then there is a staff, another Boolean field used to determine whether the user is a staff member. This field controls whether they can log in to the Django admin. Here's a small part of the user model that we are going to create in the next video. So that's everything that we are going to be defining for our user model. Now let's take a look at the user model manager. When you create a custom user model, you also need to create a custom manager. You also need to create a custom manager for it, usually by extending base user manager. This manager handles things like creating users, creating super users, validating required fields, managing default behavior when interacting with the user model through the command line or admin. But why it's important? Django's built-in user model uses a manager under the hood to create users with create a super user and create user. So when you override the user model, you lose the built-in behavior. So you need to recreate it in your custom manager. Here's a code snippet of the user manager that we will be creating in the next video. So that's an overview of the Django user model. Now let's move on to the next lesson where we are going to design our custom user model.